Born on a small Danish farm in 1890, with the name of Alfred Julius Emmanuel Sorenson, the future Sunyata, at the time of his birth, had two sisters, 12 and 14. As he was only educated up to the 8th grade, he would often joke that he had escaped education, a term he used to refer to most education, which is a mental conditioning that keeps attention focused on the external world. During his childhood, a big shock occurred when he was 14, and the family farm was sold to strangers who had no respect for the land. He began an apprenticeship in horticulture and eventually moved to England, where he became what he referred to as a simple gardener. He worked in England from 6 in the morning to 6 in the evening in such big estates as Forty Hall, Sunbury Court, Hampton Court, and Dartington Hall. While he was working on the gardens of Dartington Hall in Devonshire, Rabindranath Tagore, the Indian poet, came to speak. Emmanuel, and his name means the indwelling God, and his favorite Western name for himself, played a Beethoven quartet for Tagore on an old gramophone. Tagore was so impressed with the quality of Emmanuel's silence, his lack of willfulness and ego desires, that he invited him to come to India to teach silence. But how can you teach something except by being it? Being it he was, and his arrival in India in 1930, in his 40th year, marked the beginning of a new phase in his life's drama. People immediately thrust titles upon him like Baba, Saint, and Guru. But none of these names seemed true to his being. He did accept small gifts from people, but refused them if they were more than he needed at the time. For 45 years he was to live in India, where his work was simple, just be, and his days as a gardener a thing of the past. Everything was given to him. In his words, he said, "We live so close to heaven." Once he arrived at Ramana ashram in 1936, and Emmanuel soon realized that he had never before met this quality of consciousness in any living being. Later in his life, he said about this meeting, "Never before had I awared such integral self-radiance in any human form, such light of silence. One was being fed just awaring him. At the first sight of him, I felt no excitement or even awe, no solemnity or ecstasy, simply a calm recognition, a glad contentment, and gratitude in his darshan." He had heard of Sri Ramana Maharshi while in Kashmir and Tibet from lamas, and later from Paul Brunton and Dr. Evans Wentz. After spending several years in the Himalayas, he did come to the Maharshi, and 3 more times after that. When Emmanuel first arrived, Ramana asked him his name and nationality and inquired about mutual friends and his sadhana, that is, the way he had come. Emmanuel was put up in one of the ashram guest houses, and during his 2-week stay, spent many of his days sitting in the back of the meditation hall, soaking in the quality of Ramana's radiance. Unlike most of the other Westerners who came to visit the ashram, Emmanuel did not ask even one question, other than his response to those few initial questions from Ramana. There was no verbal communication between them. Emmanuel was therefore quite surprised when he later heard from Paul Brunton that soon after his departure, Ramana had referred to him as a Yanam Siddha, one of the rare-born mystics. When Emmanuel heard this phrase, rare-born mystic, he had no idea what a mystic was or what it meant to be one who was rare-born. Emmanuel soon acquired a copy of the Oxford Book of English Mystical Verse in hope of finding out what it meant to be a mystic. At the same time, he began to examine his own childhood to see why he had been able to so easily loosen his identification with ego consciousness. It was this exploration that was the origin of the reflections called memory, or true recollection, which became his book. It was during Emmanuel's third visit to Ramana Maharshi in 1940 that he acquired the name that he was to use for the rest of his life. He was just sitting quietly in meditation when he awared an effulgence, a spiritual flood of light, especially radiated and directed upon his form, and suddenly out of the silence, an unsolicited telepathic-like message from Ramana Maharshi in the form of these 5 English words: "We are always aware, Sunyata." What surprised him most in this message was the word always. Although he had often transmuted Shakespeare's phrase that ripeness is all into his own saying, awareness is all, up to that moment he had never realized who he was is always aware. He also asked himself, who is this we? Did it mean Ramana Maharshi and himself, or did it include everyone? Eventually, he realized that we is the indwelling inner standing, the word. Another surprise was that Ramana, a Hindu sage, had used the Buddhist term sunyata, often translated as the void or full solid emptiness. The Buddhist doctrine of sunyata asserts that all beings and phenomena are free of any soul or intrinsic nature. This means that although people, things, and events appear on the outside to be real and substantial, they are in actuality, when understood, simply ephemeral and insubstantial. Sunyata took Ramana's 5 words as recognition, initiation, mantra, and name. Thereafter, he referred to both himself and the hut in which he lived as Sunyata. Like a crystal that reflects many colors, yet itself remains pure, clear, and unaffected, that's who he would always be. No thingness. Tat tvam asi. Thou art that. He later elaborated about the first darshan with the Maharshi, saying it was an unforgettable experience. Especially Sri Ramana's casual statement, "We are always aware." And this made a most powerful impact on him. It resounded in the consciousness like a chime and continued to linger in his memory like a mantra or echo. He later said, "I found Ramana Maharshi was a pure Advaita experience, and his chief language was radiant silence, to which only mature souls familiar with solitude could easily respond. When Sri Ramana was questioned by officials and was later asked if it had tired him, he said, 'No, I did not use my mind.'" For the next 4 decades, Sunyata continued to live in his Himalayan hut not far from Almora. About this new home, he said, "I was contented in Denmark, though I could see the others regarded me as an oddity. In England, I felt freer. In India, I felt at home. But in the Himalayas, I feel closest to heaven." During all those years in India, he was never employed, but found money being pushed on him. He was offered 20 rupees a month, about $2.50 US at the time, but only accepted 5. Then in 1950, the Birla Foundation in New Delhi, which is their purpose to assist saints and sadhus, asked him if he'd accept 100 rupees a month, and he agreed to accept 20. later saying, "It was more than I needed at the time, but I thought prices might rise." It was later raised to 50 rupees, where it remained for more than 20 years. Even after inflation made it hard to live on 50, Sunyata would never consider getting a raise through asking. Living nearby to his Himalayan hut on Crank's Ridge were neighbors, the Tibetan Buddhist scholars Lama Anagarika Govinda and Dr. Walter Evans Wentz. He would often make pilgrimages to the plains of India during the winter season and return to his hut high in the mountains when the plains began to sizzle with the summer heat. He became personally acquainted with such leaders of the Indian independence movement as Mahatma Gandhi and Jawaharlal Nehru. He also came to know Anandamayi Ma and Neem Karoli Baba, and many realized beings who are virtually unknown in the West. He later said of his sadhana, "In my sadhana, I was told by the invisible monitor, 'From today, you are not to make obeisance to anybody.' Later on, I again heard the voice within myself which told me, 'Whom do you want to bow down to? You are everything.' At once, I realized that the universe was, after all, my own manifestation. Partial knowledge then gave place to the integral inherent wisdom, and I found myself face to face with the Advaita, the one that appears as many." He further stated that during this period many vibhuti powers were manifesting, though to anyone's knowledge he told no one about this during his life. Sunyata seems to have had, among others, the CD that naturally appeared of healing touch. He described how he found that whenever he touched a patient in need, that individual would be immediately cured. He says he tested this on a number of people and found it to be invariably true. The story of Sunyata's stay in India would not be complete without mentioning his plucky black and white dog named Wuti. Wuti was brought from Tibet in a sack along with a lion cub in 1950, and he became Sunyata's constant companion for the next 9 years. Sunyata named him Wuti because that was the sound he made when he barked. And when the Indian saint Anandamayi Ma looked at Wuti, she announced, "This is not a dog." Thereafter, she permitted Wuti into the inner sanctum of her ashram where no dogs were allowed. After Wuti died, Sunyata changed Wuti's name to Wuji and used this term, Wuji, to refer to his own higher self. When Sunyata was asked why he changed his name from Wuti to Wuji, he replied, "Adding Ji to a name is what is done in India to show respect. The dog needed less bark and more bite." Sunyata would have been happy and content to live in India for the remainder of his bodily life. He never had any desire to go anywhere, let alone to America. But in November 1973, a group of seekers from California associated with the Alan Watts Society went to India to visit Lama Govinda, Sunyata's friend and neighbor. A local villager just happened to mention to the group that there lived a solitary hermit-type ancient one who they might want to visit. They went to Sunyata's hut and decided that indeed he was the enlightened one. And one of the group members told him, "You'll be in California next year." Sunyata protested, "But I have nothing to teach and nothing to sell." And the young man said, "That's why we want you." And off he trotted. Eventually, one of these visitors sent Sunyata a round-trip plane ticket to California with the promise, reality-wise, Sunyata need not do anything. When he was invited to settle in America, Sunyata believed that his life was drawing to an end. Here he was, a man in his 80s, who had spent many of the last decades in silence. Over the years, however, he had developed a language to talk about his reality and had discovered that there was an unusually good rapport with some of the spiritual seekers who had come from the West to visit India. Prarabdha karma, Sunyata once explained, is the karma that cannot be changed in one's lifetime. So it was his prarabdha karma to first come to America at the tender young age of 84. One of the few places in America that had ever really interested him was, coincidentally, California. When he was a young man living in England, he had been exposed to the teachings of the Theosophists, who had spoken about a new race of people being born in several geographical locations, one of which was supposed to be in California. And if a new race was being born, he wanted to be there for the birthing. So for the last 6 years of his life, he made his home in California, saying, "I take my home with me wherever I go." He made no effort to do anything. His mode was simple, to be. Many people claim that significant changes in their life would occur after meeting him, but he would always say, "I do nothing, it just happens. Everything always happens rightly. All is right that seems most wrong." While crossing a busy intersection in Fairfax, California on a Sunday, August 5th, 1984, he was struck by a car. He was taken to a nearby Ross hospital, but by the evening he had entered into a coma. He lived another 8 days, but never regained consciousness.